Our first guest in the Regenerate series, if you haven't watched it, you need to watch it after this interview, was with Joel Salatin, the Shenandoah Valley farmer. He describes himself as an environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer. I'm not sure if our guest today is quite as much a lunatic as Joel. That might be hard to do. But her project is also a form of what we might think of as agricultural lunacy, which is why she's on the show and why her project is so exciting. Isabella Tree is the co-owner of a farm in Sussex in the UK, a 3,500-acre farm, which in 2001 she threw back to nature. This so-called Rewilding project has received significant acclaim and controversy. And it is another form of lunacy, which I think fits very much into our regeneration project. Izzy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So in 2001, when you introduced this wilding project on your 3,500-acre farm, did you think it was madness? Was it a form of lunacy? Did you question yourself?
We were quite confident with what we were doing, but I know that from the perimeters, we were considered to be lunatics. For us, it was very straightforward. We're on incredibly heavy clay, 320 meters of the stuff. It's notorious where we live, the heavy Sussex Weald. And farming, conventionally, arable and dairy, we tried it for 17 years. We'd thrown everything at it that we possibly could, and we could not turn a profit. By 1999, we were £1.5 million in debt. And we had to find something else to do with the land. And we wanted to do something that would work with the land rather than battling against it all the time. For us, it was quite a clear decision.
So you were a want-to-be capitalist farmer, but you weren't succeeding. And was the reason you weren't succeeding because of conventional farming techniques, conventional, at that point at least, farming technology?
It's a really interesting question. If we had to make the same decision now, knowing what we do about regenerative agriculture and the type of alternatives that people like Joel Salatin are pioneering, we might have thought differently. But at the time, our heavy clay doesn't lend itself to ploughing, to the use of chemicals, to all that conventional type of farming. So in the winter, if you have a wet winter like the one we just had, you can sometimes be unable to get heavy machinery onto the land for sometimes 6 months of the year. So you can't do any maintenance, you can't do ditch infrastructure, and you can't sow spring crops. You simply can't compete with lovely farms on grade 1, grade 2 soil, and we're grade 3, grade 4 here. So it's just not viable for that kind of conventional agricultural industrial style farming.
Joel, of course, calls himself an environmentalist, and I think you do as well. Do you think that one can be an environmentalist and use conventional farming techniques, putting so many chemicals back into the soil?
No, I don't think you can. And that's the strange thing. I think 20 years or so ago, when we were doing that kind of chemical farming, if you'd asked us, we would have said that we were nature lovers. We might even have called ourselves stewards of the land, like lots of farmers do. We didn't see that we were doing anything wrong. Ironically, I used to be a travel journalist. We used to travel the ends of the earth to look at wonderful wildlife. We never once considered that we could or should be having it in our own backyard, let alone that the fact that we didn't have wildlife was down to us. And it's only now that we've been on this journey for 20 years and seen what's come back on our land that we understand the damage we were doing back then.
Izzy, I love this use of the word see. Try to remember what your eyes saw before 2001. What did your farm look like before you rewilded it?
Well, I'm looking out of my window now, out of the front of the house, and it was ploughed right up to the front door. So all you would see from here, beneath the ancient oaks, would have been, serried ranks of arable. It would have been barley or maize, corn, or wheat. Occasionally, it would be alternated with Italian ryegrass, so that we would turn out the dairy cows onto that. But it was always working, endlessly working. So what was interesting, I think, to us was it wasn't just the visuals that changed. When we began to take these initial baby steps into conservation, and we attracted funding to restore the old Repton Park around the house. We took 350 acres out of the farm around the house for this park restoration project. It was really restoring a landscape from the 19th century. And we reseeded it with local wildflower seeds and native grasses. And that following summer, the sound of insects was absolutely astonishing. And as farmers, we hadn't even known we'd been missing that. So it's the sound as well as the sight that's so astonishing.
So it's the visuals and the acoustics. Izzy, not everyone who is watching this will have the good fortune to have seen your farm. So imagine our watchers are, so to speak, blind in what exists outside your window. Describe it today. You've described the pre-2001 visual of a very traditionally well-organized, neat and tidy, perhaps rather anal visual landscape. What does it look like now when you look out of your window?
Well, if I look out of my window here, any moment I could see a herd of feral ponies galloping across in front of the windows. We've got free-roaming herds of Old English Longhorn. You've got swifts darting about through the sky, catching insects. At the moment, they're screaming that lovely high-pitched scream. If you go further afield, you've got the hedgerows that are now billowing out, probably double, triple their size. They're now housing nightingales. That's fantastic nesting habitat for nightingales, one of our critically endangered bird species. And then you go further, deeper into the project, and it begins to look like Africa. So it looks like an African savanna, thorny scrub. You've got animal trails wandering through that scrub. So it feels alive. The surround sound, bird song and insects, but you also, because you have the evidence of these megafauna tracks, it almost feels like a rhino or a hippo could be coming out of the bush at you, or you could see a giraffe sticking its neck up above the scrub. It's got that very bush feel about it. And that's what's hugely been missing from our landscape, is the thorny scrub, that habitat.
Izzy, you're a former and I think current travel journalist. You know that one of the big fashions now in travel is to, at least before the coronavirus, was to go to Africa on safari. But what you're suggesting then is that wealthy Londoners could come down to Sussex and have the same safari-like experience.
Absolutely, and it's not just the wealthy. We have a campsite too, which is very, very modest fee. So we're very keen that anybody can come and visit and see astonishing wildlife. A kingfisher is one of the most exotic birds there is. We now have white storks breeding back in England on our land for the first time in 600 years. We've got really exotic wildlife, a lot of them African migrants, and it's wonderful to be able to celebrate that. And it's certainly something we've been noticing since lockdown. Since lockdown has been released, that desperate need we have to reconnect with nature. We've had 2,500 people come since the lockdown restrictions were released about a month ago to see just the white storks, and thousands of people using our footpaths. It's an astonishment to me that people in towns have to get into a car to get to a piece of nature, to go for a walk. And we have to change that.
So does that confirm E.O. Wilson's theory that there's something intrinsic in us as a species that longs for nature?
Absolutely. I think that biophilia is in all of us. And I think that's certainly something that's come to light under COVID. You know, we miss it. We mourn when we can't get something goes very awry in us, I think. We've only been urban for a blip in our evolution. And the the fact that we've been able to, you know, under this very strange restrictions, being able to hear birdsong and perhaps stop and stand and be still and listen, it's become very important to people, I think. So definitely that connection with nature and those amazing video footage of seeing wild boar careering through Italian towns and all sorts of animals, the goats in Llandudno, I think it was, in Wales, you know, entering our urban spaces again. It shows us what could be. You know, our green spaces are deserts. You know, let's get them active again.
Because you don't hold back on this in terms of the impact on humanity. How much, in very broad terms, has the chemical revolution in farming and the essential destruction of the soil, how much has it destroyed human civilization?
Well, we've seen throughout history, you know, go back into deep history, that civilization after civilization after civilization has crashed through precisely what we're doing now, which is destroying the soil. And we're just precipitating that even faster by using chemicals. But the plow was one of the worst inventions man has ever come up with. We have to halt that process. And we know from amazing pioneers like Joel Salatin, but also from Gabe Brown, from people in the States, and also from people in Australia, people in the brittle zones that are really hurting. People, you know, like Charlie Massey, who wrote a wonderful book, The Call of the Reed Warbler, that regenerative farming is just as productive eventually after a transition, and with no inputs, and it starts sequestering carbon. And this is the key. Nature has all the answers to food security, to water storage, flood mitigation, soil restoration, and carbon sequestration. If we can get all of that, if we switch to regenerative agriculture where we're producing food, and in the areas where we're not producing food, we rewild. And those two key aspects work fantastically together.
Before we get to the economics of regenerative agriculture, you make it all seem very easy. Your book is a bestseller. You're a media personality. You're pioneering, or you're one of the pioneers of the rewilding movement. But there must have been times where this was a challenge. There must have been moments when you woke up in 2002 or 2003, where you or your husband thought to yourselves, "Oh my God, what have we done? Is this a huge mistake?" What was the darkest moment in the transition of the farm?
I think we never had any doubts, because I think we could see what was coming back. Already, you know, the insect life was astonishing. We began to see these rare species finding us. We knew we were onto something really special. But I think the difficulty for us, and particularly for my husband, were the very personal letters of sort of affront, really, that we received. A huge mailbag. People were even writing letters to the MPs, to government, to try and stop the project. And I think it was really an unsettling sense that people had, understandably perhaps, when you're looking over the fence at a piece of land that has been micromanaged and orderly, that fits with the aesthetic that you have in your head about what the green and pleasant land of England should look like. And suddenly your neighbours are just turning it into a riot of creeping thistle and ragwort and thorny scrub. You wonder what the hell's going on. And so that was difficult, having to make our case when there was such an outcry against the project. We held our nerve, and luckily we had advisors and scientists and ecologists who backed us up and were able to keep it on course. But I think the closest we ever came to wobbling was when suddenly this creeping thistle, which is it's a pioneer species, and it came into the park and also to the northern bit of the estate. It covered hundreds of acres. And we had made this pledge, to ourselves that rewilding is all about taking your hands off the steering wheel and allowing natural processes to happen, allowing nature to take the driving seat. And this creeping thistle kept on coming, and the letters got more and more vociferous. And Charlie, my husband, was really thinking he was going to have to get out there with the toppers and the herbicide, like he would have done in the bad old farming days, just to quieten the neighbors down. And just when he was thinking about doing that, we woke up one morning and we were seeing painted lady butterflies passing our window like tracer. And we couldn't understand where they were going. And it was a boom year for painted lady butterflies. They'd migrated up from Morocco, and they had come to Nep and other places where there was creeping thistle. And they descended on the creeping thistle. They laid their eggs. And over that summer, the caterpillars hatched out and tore to shreds those creeping thistles. And the next year, there wasn't a single plant standing. And I think that gave us real confidence early on that nature does know what it's about. And if you just have patience and allow those boom and bust cycles to perform and play themselves out, it's all okay in the end. And en route, all sorts of other species benefit.
So there is a natural regenerative narrative to nature. And listening to that story, Izzy, perhaps you are in some ways as much a lunatic as Joel Salatin, who also had that vision and was willing to stand up to conventional wisdom and society. Do you think one of the reasons why you and your husband went through with this was because both of you are from very upper class families, very distinguished British aristocratic families? Do you think mere mortals, parts of the English bourgeoisie, would have had the nerve to do what you did? Does it require a degree of eccentricity, of classic British aristocratic eccentricity, to pull this one off?
I don't know if it's eccentricity. I think it's my husband's very pragmatic, and I think it was purely and simply in the early days, it was a financial decision. We had hit the buffers and we had to move on and do something else. I think that's what's happened to a lot of these pioneering regenerative agricultural farmers, is they hit the buffers, they have to think imaginatively. It's only when, if you're in a failing business and you're stuck in the headlights, all you're thinking of is how to survive to the next week, the next month, the next year. It's when you make that big decision. And I think that was the moment when Charlie was perhaps brave enough to go against the grain, literally, and call an end to farming. Then you're free, and you can allow your mind to expand, and you can listen to other people. You can stand back and look objectively at your situation and what you could or even should have been doing long ago. I think also my husband grew up in Africa to begin with when he was little, and then in Australia. And I think he had a sense that a lot of English people perhaps don't, of big landscapes and herds of free roaming animals. He understood that dynamic very kind of instinctively. And so he could translate that idea into the Sussex countryside when perhaps a lot of people wouldn't. And I think the other thing is perhaps, he didn't grow up here on this piece of land. And we've often questioned ourselves and wondered why a lot of people in the same conditions, the same boat as us, hadn't made the leap. And I think there's this nostalgia for a countryside that we've grown up in, even if we know intellectually that it's not functioning and we're losing biodiversity year by year. There's still an emotional bond with it, and it's very difficult to see it change. And so I think, having not grown up here, he wasn't perhaps so emotionally invested in it as perhaps if he had. I think those are all sort of dynamics that kind of worked in when I was trying to work out, when I was writing the book, what were the reasons that helped us to make a leap. But then, of course, now lots of people are doing it, and it's catching on all over Britain. It's very, very exciting to see it.
Izzy, as I suggested in the introduction, Joel not only describes himself as a lunatic environmental farmer, but he also embraces the idea of capitalism, and he describes himself as a libertarian capitalist. He's not a great friend of the government, which has got him into trouble from time to time. What is the business model? What is the capitalist model for your project? Are you making money? Did you intend to make money? Because the way you're presenting the story suggests that the old model was a failure in economic terms, and only by turning the thing on its head have you saved the business itself, the land, which is money in your mind at least.
Yeah, I mean, when we were farming, the only thing keeping us afloat was subsidies. European subsidies and
government subsidies, which
yeah.
Joel will be, if he's listening to this, will be bashing the screen. No government subsidies.
Yeah, and it completely skewed the picture. So even now, I think I'm right in saying over 40%, it might be 43% of the entire EU budget goes on farming subsidies. So incentivizing farmers to grow mainly arable in areas irrespective of whether that land is appropriate for growing that crop or not. It's absolute lunacy. We thought that the subsidies would go much sooner than, well, they haven't even gone yet. And so we thought if subsidies go, we are absolutely shot. We've got to try something else. We still do get an agri-environment subsidy, higher level stewardship scheme it's called. We hope that when the transition after Brexit happens, it will move into something called ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And that is very exciting, actually. We personally were very dismayed at leaving Europe. But there is this opportunity to reform the subsidy system that we've been tied to for so long. And the British government now seems to be going down the route of rewarding farmers and land managers, not simply for producing food irrespective of the environmental damage, but actually incentivizing land managers to do all these public goods. So sequestering carbon, restoring the soils, doing mitigating against floods, water storage, biodiversity, an amenity for people to enjoy, that nature, all that. So you'll be able to apply for grants for what you're doing. And this will be a complete game changer for farmers. But even if that doesn't come to pass, and we daren't kind of rely on that, we are now a profitable business. We have an ecotourism business. Sorry about that.
That was the ecotourist on the phone, right?
Yes, the government on the phone. We have an ecotourism business. We're selling meat still, so we are, in a sense, we're still farmers. We produce 35 tons of beef, free-roaming beef and pork and venison a year. And there's an increasing demand, I think, for ethical meat. If you're still eating meat, I think people are thinking more consciously about where it comes from. And so rewilding, I think, is a good outlet for that. But also all the agricultural farm buildings that were just simply part of the infrastructure before, that cost us an arm and a leg to keep the roof on, are now bringing in an income. We're converting them slowly, and now largely for office space. Actually, there's such a desire for people not wanting to sit in a traffic jam for an hour to get into town. So, they can sit and look at pigs diving for swan mussels in a lake instead. It's much more attractive prospect.
Certainly,
so
yeah.
There's definitely, that's become a big income stream for us too.
Is excusing the agricultural pun here, but when it comes to the chicken and the egg of changing both our taste and our agriculture, how scalable is your model? I mean, given that most consumers are still addicted to fast food and white bread, can your model scale nationally? It's all very well to have a few one-offs dotted around the country, but can it break through in a broad economic sense? Does it work when it comes to supplying the supermarkets, the Safeways and the Waitrose and the Whole Foods in the United States?
I mean, remember, we're not about farming, we're about nature. So the fact that we're producing a relatively small amount of meat off the project is really incidental to what we're doing. That's not our main business. Our main business is nature restoration. But certainly with regenerative agriculture, yes, to all of the above. We do, though, I think, have to start rethinking about how we eat meat. We have to get rid of industrialized meat production. It's unsustainable, it's unethical, it's unhealthy. So we are going to have to eat less meat than we're used to, I think. But that is not a bad thing. And it's only a few decades ago, you go back to the 1950s, where we were eating probably a much more realistic amount of proteins in the form of meat. Certainly in the UK, I think we can do a lot to start changing our crops from arable to pulses and beans to create both higher profit margins, but also more protein. Arables are very greedy crop, and we're overproducing it. We're now having to feed it not only to our animals, but to our cars to try and get rid of it. It's a bizarre situation. So I think, there's no problem, I think, with feeding the planet. We know already that we're feeding enough, we're producing enough food for 10 billion people, and we waste 40% of it. Let's address that waste, first of all, and let's start rethinking agriculture and turning the Titanic around. Yeah.
How would rewilding the industrial farms of the Midwestern part of the United States work, given the enormous scale of these endeavors? Is it possible?
Well, I think if it's prime agricultural land, you probably wouldn't want to be rewilding it. You probably wouldn't want to be doing a nature conservation project on that land. You probably want to still be using it for food production. And in that case, you would turn to regenerative agriculture. I think you should still have rewilded areas running through even our intensive food production areas, because it will be better for wildlife, certainly regen ag, but you want to have truly rewilded corridors and areas that can connect big areas of nature together, so that you have systems working again. You get wildlife populations beginning to move through the landscape again, and more biodiversity for people to enjoy. Why should you be deprived of, say, sparrowhawks and white storks and whatever, because you're living in an area of food production? It can all happen together, and I think rewilding very much bolsters regen ag. It can provide the big ecosystem functions at landscape scale, in terms of pollinating insects, the pest control, and the water, the natural hydrology, as well as perhaps even the treescapes that are needed to sequester carbon and also to protect agricultural areas. It all can work together.
You've mentioned that before, the sequestering of carbon. Could you explain that? Is that a business, or is it a philosophical ideal?
Well, we know that from our soil testing here that we have doubled our carbon content in the soil within 20 years. We're also, because we've restored our wetlands, and we've also got vegetation pulse happening on our land. We've got trees growing into larger trees. All of that is sequestering carbon. So we've gone from being a net carbon emitter and carbon user, particularly in the form of fossil fuels, in the form of fertilizers and all the heavy machinery that we were using, the transportation, to being a carbon sink. And so I think rewilding and regenerative agriculture are going to answer the question of how we can combat climate change. Nature itself, and the soil in particular, is going to be the biggest solution to carbon.
So that's a pretty radical statement. There's an endless debate, of course, within the green movement. But would you suggest then that regenerative agriculture should be a central plank in any Green New Deal?
Absolutely. Absolutely, categorically, yes.
And are there politicians in Europe or the United States who you think are doing justice to the idea of regenerative agriculture?
I think it's happening. It is absolutely going to happen. Already, Europe has announced its Green Deal, and it's almost leapfrogging what's been happening in the UK. It's spreading like wildfire. This idea. I think the big problem is the conventional food and farming industry. They have such vested interests in slowing this momentum down. If not, they're trying to reverse the trend of change. I think that's impossible. I think regen ag is on the horizon and it's here to stay. It's a question of if we can get it to happen sooner rather than later. I see the big food and farming industry lobby very much like the fossil fuel lobby, trying to slow down the pace of change towards alternative energy. 20 years ago, we couldn't have imagined that alternative energy would have eclipsed fossil fuels, but it has. We know the direction of travel there now. And I think that's what's happening now with agriculture.
Izzy, a lot of people will be watching this and think to themselves, this is a wonderful idea, but I live in a city. I have a small yard. I might have even a garden on my balcony. Can people who don't have the good or the bad luck to own a farm, can they do regenerative agriculture?
Absolutely. I think everyone can play their part in rewilding. I think it's just it's a change of mindset. And I think if you stop using chemicals, there's all sorts of things you can do. And there's wonderful books out there that show you how to rewild a garden. We're just writing a book, The Wilding Handbook, which I hope is going to cover everything from, say, 10,000 hectares to your back garden, to an orchard, to a window box, to a cemetery, to the verges around your town. I think the key as well is connectivity. A friend of mine has rewilded his garden in Bristol, which of course is now stuffed full of wildlife. It's lovely. But what he's done is he's talked to his neighbours. And so one of them has a pond, another has a beetle bank, another has an area of nettles and bramble. They've cut hedgehog holes in their fences between them. So now that back street of gardens is a wildlife corridor. Now, if you connect that with an inner city park, a railway embankment, a canal leading out into the countryside, suddenly you've got wildlife pulsing back into cities again. And I think that's how we have to think. Wellington in New Zealand is a city, a town that has done exactly that. It's got wildlife ebbing and flowing right into the center of the towns again. Sorry, there's a government again.
It's the Wellington people. You gave them a plug. The examples you bring up are very encouraging, but again, I'm surprised you haven't brought up any examples from Denmark, because that always seems to be the place that's on the cutting edge of these sorts of things. New Zealand, Denmark, Sussex, but what about America, Russia, China, the great powers? What's happening on that front? Anything encouraging?
Well, I'm not very familiar with Russia and China. I know there are some amazing regenerative projects in China, a lot of tree planting. And again, this can be problematic, I think. Obviously, trees, hugely important carbon sequestration, attracting rain, they can change weather patterns, all that. But I do have a problem with actually just going out and simply planting trees. Natural regeneration would be my favored way of doing it, very low carbon. And it's also much better for biodiversity, and having free roaming animals in amongst all that would be much, much more exciting, I think. Otherwise, we're just going to cover the world in plantations again, which could be another problem. In the States, I think there's lots of exciting things happening. Of course, the American Prairie Project, everyone knows about, really exciting stuff. But I think there's still, we traveled up the coast of California all the way up to Seattle last year on my book tour, which was great fun. And I think there's still a way to go in the States. I think you're so lucky over there with your wilderness areas. And I think there's still a convention that, you know, nature red in tooth and claw is that's where it belongs. But I think if we go back to wonderful E.O. Wilson again and one of his latest books, Half Earth, you know, what he is saying is that if we are going to stabilize our systems, of which biodiversity is a kind of articulation of success, if we're going to save biodiversity and the systems on which we depend as well as a species, we have to devote half the landmass on our planet, half Earth, to nature. And how do we do that? We have to be generous. Our existing nature reserves and wildernesses are not anywhere near enough. We have to bring nature back into our own backyards. And that's in agriculture, as well as in our gardens, as well as in every spare green space we can find. We've got to get it active again.
Finally, Izzy, this is a wonderful conversation, but step back. We're talking in July 2020. As we speak, the world seems to be in complete meltdown. There's a crisis not only in our health system, but in global capitalism, in global democracy as well. Many people are questioning more and more the political, the economic, the environmental, and of course, the technological way we live. What has your experiment at Net Farm, your wilding project, taught you in very broad terms about regenerating the world itself, not just of agriculture, but of politics and economics and culture?
I think it's taught us that everything is connected. And so I think, you know, we can't look at economics just as a separate thing from politics or from the environment. Everything comes down eventually to the soil and what the soil can produce. And capitalism is all tied up with the whole way we view and have used nature. And if that has been dysfunctional, then we have to change it. I think we're going through a big change, a moment of big flux, and that's very uncomfortable. But it is also full of opportunity. I don't want to be complacent because we can make the wrong choices still. But I think there is still enormous room for hope. And I think, if anything, what's happened here at NEP has, I think, shown us that things can turn around very, very quickly. In less than 20 years, you know, we've now become one of the most biodiverse hotspots in the UK, from having been one of the most depleted pieces of land you could have imagined. So there is, I think, enormous room for hope. And if we don't have hope, then I think we all become inactive and despairing and paralyzed. So I'm an optimist, I think, by nature, but I think nature has also taught me to be an optimist.